What does the most powerful prayer in the world truly sound like? Is it the one shouted from a brightly lit stage, amplified for thousands to hear? Is it the one chanted in perfect ancient unison inside a grand cathedral, its echoes bouncing off stone walls and stained glass windows? Or is it something else entirely? Is it just a silent whisper, spoken in a place the world has long forgotten, by a voice so small it can barely be heard over the sound of its own breaking heart? Our story begins in one of those forgotten places. An alleyway, tucked behind a row of tired, small houses in a town you probably couldn't find on a map. Dusk is settling in, that quiet time of day, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft, weary grey. The air is cool and still. Here weeds grow wild through the deep cracks in the pavement, like desperate green fingers reaching for the last bit of fading light. An old, faded armchair, its stuffing spilling from a tear in the side, slumps against a brick wall like a defeated old man. This isn't a place for grand events or new beginnings. It's a place where things are left behind, a place where things end. But tonight, in this place of endings, something is about to begin. If you look closely, past the long shadows and the discarded things, you can see him. Just a small silhouette against the last of the daylight. A little boy, on his knees, on the cold, hard ground. His hands are clasped together so tightly that his knuckles have turned white. His small shoulders tremble, but not from the evening chill. He isn't making a sound, yet his entire small body is a scream, a silent, desperate plea launched into the vast, quiet universe, carrying a weight that no child should ever have to bear. We are taught to pray for miracles, aren't we? We're told to ask for grand signs, for divine interventions that part the seas and move the mountains. We watch the sky, waiting for it to open with a flash of lightning and a voice like thunder. But what if we've been looking in the wrong direction all this time? What if the greatest miracle doesn't arrive with a thunderclap or a sudden blinding light? What if it doesn't come to erase our problems in an instant? What if instead it comes quietly, without a sound, and simply kneels beside us in our darkest moment, sharing our brokenness on the cold, unforgiving ground? This is the story of a prayer like that, a prayer that wouldn't be heard in any church, but one that was about to shatter the very foundations of heaven. That boy's name is Lucas, and his world was a universe of silence, held within the four walls of a small, tired house on a street that had seen better days. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the unspoken. The only sounds were the low, constant hum of the old refrigerator and the faint, shallow rhythm of his mother's breathing from the bedroom down the hall. Each breath was a question, and Lucas lived in terror of the day it would go unanswered. The house was clean, but it was the kind of clean that comes from necessity, not joy. On the nightstand next to his mother's bed, a row of orange prescription bottles stood like soldiers in a losing battle. A glass of water sat beside them, a small rainbow of light refracted through it, the only spot of color in the dim room. Taped to the peeling paint on the kitchen wall was a child's drawing. A bright yellow sun with a huge crayon-drawn smile, a testament to a time before the shadows grew so long. It was Lucas's work, a desperate attempt to hang on to the light. His days didn't start with cartoons or arguments over cereal. They started with a quiet dread. He would tiptoe to his mother's room, his small hand hovering over the doorknob. He'd pause, hold his own breath, and just listen, listening for her breath. Only when he heard it, thin and fragile, could his own day begin. He was 8 years old, but his shoulders were stooped with the weight of a man's worries. He'd check her. Temperature, his small fingers clumsy with the thermometer. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he'd whisper. Sometimes Sarah would manage a weak smile. "Better, sweetie, thanks to you." Her voice was a wisp of its former self, but to Lucas it was an orchestra. On other days she couldn't speak at all, only offering a slight squeeze of his hand. Those were the hard days. He learned to cook, sort of. Toasted cheese sandwiches, often a little burnt around the edges. canned soup, heated on the stove, which he'd carry to her bedside on a tray, his steps careful, his focus intense. He'd sit with her while she tried to eat, watching every spoonful, his heart sinking when she'd push the bowl away after only a few bites. "I'm sorry, Lucas," she'd murmur. "I'm just not hungry." And he would nod, trying to make his face look brave before taking the half-eaten bowl back to the kitchen, a lump of failure lodged in his own throat. There were no friends calling, no sleepovers, no scraped knees from playing outside. The sounds of other children laughing and shouting in the street felt like they were coming from another planet. He was an island, and his mother was the only other inhabitant. He did his homework at the small kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He'd read the words in his textbook, but his mind was always somewhere else, listening, always listening for a cough, a moan, any sign that she needed him. The fear was his constant companion. It sat with him at dinner. It lay beside him in bed at night. It was a cold, heavy thing in the pit of his stomach, a fear so big it felt like it would swallow him whole. He was terrified of the silence getting louder, terrified of opening her door and finding her gone. He was a little boy trying to hold back the ocean with a plastic bucket, and he knew, with the grim certainty of a child forced to grow up too fast, that the tide was coming in. He was carrying a burden that would have crushed most adults, and he was doing it all alone. The cold from the pavement had seeped deep into his bones, but he barely noticed. His tears had stopped, leaving salty tracks on his grimy cheeks. He was just an empty little shell in a forgotten alley. And then, a warmth. It wasn't the sun, which had long since surrendered the sky to a bruised purple twilight. This was a different kind of warmth, one that started on his shoulder and spread through his chest like a slow, calming breath. He flinched, expecting a scolding. A voice, maybe a security guard telling him to move along, but the hand on his shoulder was impossibly gentle. Lucas slowly lifted his head, his eyes blurry. Kneeling beside him, right there on the cracked concrete among the weeds and discarded trash, was a man. His clothes were plain, like something a carpenter or a gardener might wear. His face was kind, etched with lines that didn't speak of age, but of a deep, knowing empathy. And his eyes, they held no pity, no judgment. They just understood. It was as if they had seen every fear Lucas had ever held and were not afraid of them. The man didn't offer a grand speech. His voice was quiet, a low hum that seemed to calm the very air around them. "I heard you, Lucas." The boy's breath hitched. How did he know his name? "You are not alone." And that was it. The dam inside him broke, but not with a flood of sorrow. A wave of profound, disarming peace washed over him. It wasn't the shock of seeing a stranger, it was the shock of being truly seen. For years, people had seen a brave little boy, a tiny caregiver, a responsible child. But this man, kneeling in the dirt, saw something else. He saw a scared kid who was hurting, and for the first time since his mom got sick, Lucas didn't have to pretend to be strong. He finally found his voice, a tiny, trembling whisper. It was the only question that mattered, the one that lived at the very core of his pain. "Are you going to make her better?" The man, Jesus, looked at him, and his compassionate gaze never wavered. He didn't give the easy answer, the one Lucas thought he wanted. "I am here to walk through this with you, Lucas. The healing has already begun, but it may not look the way you expect." He paused, letting the words settle. A true miracle isn't always the instant removal of a storm. Sometimes it's the strength and peace to walk through it without being washed away. Jesus explained that the most powerful changes are often slow, quiet things, forged in the fires of endurance. He wasn't a magician here to erase the problem. He was a companion, a promise that Lucas would never, ever have to face the darkness by himself again. And in that moment, Lucas began to understand a new and radical truth. God's presence is the miracle. The next morning, the little house felt different. The usual heavy silence was replaced by something lighter. When Lucas tiptoed into his mother's room, He stopped in the doorway. Sarah was sitting up in bed, propped against the pillows, looking out the window at the morning light. A faint sliver of color had returned to her cheeks. When she turned to him, she smiled. It wasn't the weak, tired smile he was used to. It was a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "Good morning, sweetie," she said, her voice clearer than it had been in weeks. "I had the most peaceful sleep. I feel a little bit stronger today." It wasn't a cure. She was still frail, the illness still a shadow in the room. But it was something. It was a tangible shift, a small but undeniable sign of progress. Lucas's heart swelled with a fragile, cautious hope. He looked toward the back door, toward the alley, and he could almost feel the lingering warmth of the presence from the night before. Later that day, a soft knock came at the front door. Lucas opened it to find Mr. Henderson, the elderly widower from next door. Lucas had only ever seen him from a distance, tending to his roses. In his hands, Mr. Henderson held a steaming pot covered with a kitchen towel and a paper bag full of groceries. "Hey there, son," the old man said with a kind, wrinkled smile. "I was at the store and I just had this feeling you folks could use this. Chicken soup. Good for the soul, they say." He placed the items carefully on the doorstep. "No need to say anything," and with a gentle nod, he turned and walked back to his own house. As Lucas carried the warm pot and the heavy bag inside, the smell of chicken and vegetables filling the small kitchen, he felt that presence beside him again. A quiet thought entered his mind, as clear as if it were spoken aloud. "See, Lucas, this is how I often work, not with lightning from the sky, but with the quiet kindness of a neighbor. My love is made real through the hands and hearts of people who choose to care." The hope began to feel less fragile. For a few days, it felt steady, but this journey was not a straight line. Just as Lucas started to breathe a little easier, the storm returned. One afternoon, Sarah's fever spiked. The weakness came back with a vengeance, erasing the small progress they had made. She was shivering, her face pale with pain, and the light in her eyes dimmed once more. Despair crashed over Lucas like an icy wave. The new hope felt like a cruel trick, a lie. His small heart, which had just started to open up, was slammed shut by a raw, bitter anger. He couldn't even look at his mother's face. He turned and ran. He fled out the back door, his feet pounding against the ground, his vision blurred by hot, angry tears. He ran straight back to the alley. "I thought you were helping," he screamed at the empty space, his voice cracking with betrayal. "Why did you let this happen? Was it all just a dream, a joke?" He kicked a loose stone, sending it skittering across the pavement. The silence that answered him felt mocking, but he wasn't alone. The gentle warmth returned, wrapping around his shaking shoulders. Jesus was there again, kneeling beside him, his expression just as compassionate as before. Jesus' voice was not a sound, but a feeling that bloomed in Lucas's mind, gentle and clear. "I want to show you something, Lucas. Look at what you do." An image surfaced in the boy's memory, his own small hand, holding his mother's, tracing circles on her palm until her pained breathing eased. Another memory followed, his voice, small but steady, reading a chapter from an old library book, the story creating a tiny island of escape in the quiet, sick room. He saw himself wiping the counter, checking the thermostat, never ever giving up, even when his own hope felt like a flickering candle in a storm. "That love," the voice continued, full of warmth, "is the most powerful medicine of all. You are not just a boy waiting for a miracle, Lucas. You are an active part of it. Your love is a channel for my healing." The words settled deep inside him, not just in his ears, but in his very bones. For the first time, Lucas saw himself differently. He wasn't a helpless victim, a small boy drowning in a situation too big for him. He was a warrior of love, fighting a battle with soup spoons and bedtime stories, with quiet patience and a hand to hold in the dark. A few afternoons later, Sarah was having one of her silent days. Her eyes were open, but she was too weak to speak, lost in a fog of pain and exhaustion. The old panic started to rise in Lucas's throat, the frantic urge to do something, to fix it. But then he remembered. He pulled his small wooden chair up to her bedside, the one he used for his homework. He didn't try to talk. He didn't try to coax her to eat or drink. He simply took her hand, his fingers fitting between hers, and sat with her. He just offered his presence. An hour passed in that shared quiet. He watched the dust motes dance in the slivers of sunlight cutting through the blinds. He listened to the house settle around them, and slowly a deep sense of peace descended upon the room. Sarah's breathing, once shallow and ragged, evened out. The tight, pained lines around her eyes softened. Lucas learned a lesson more profound than any he'd read in a book. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do for someone who is suffering is to simply be with them, to share their burden without a single word. With this new perspective, Lucas's world began to change. Or maybe the world stayed the same, but he was the one who was different. He started to notice small moments of grace he'd always been too scared or too busy to see. The way the morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, turning the old linoleum floor into a map of gold. The cheerful, defiant song of a bird on the telephone wire outside. The unexpected kindness of the cashier at the grocery store, who slipped him an extra coupon for bread. Mr. Henderson's visits became a regular comfort, no longer a surprise, but a quiet rhythm in their week. He'd knock softly, leave a small container of something warm or a newspaper, and leave with a simple nod. Lucas began to see these weren't just random events. They were little miracles, winks from God, reminders of a constant, loving presence woven into the very fabric of his ordinary, difficult life. But the fear didn't just vanish. It was a stubborn shadow that lingered in the corners of his mind, especially late at night when the house was dark and still. One night, curled in his bed, he confessed it to the silence. "I'm still scared," he whispered into his pillow. "I'm so scared all the time." And the familiar, comforting presence answered him. "Courage is not the absence of fear, Lucas. It is acting in spite of it. It is getting up every morning to care for your mother, even when you are terrified. Every time you choose love over despair, you are performing an act of immense courage." Lucas finally understood. He didn't have to defeat his fear. He just had to stop letting it be the boss. He learned to acknowledge it, to feel it, and then to hand it over in a quiet prayer, choosing instead to focus on the love that he now knew was infinitely stronger. Slowly, unevenly, Sarah's recovery began to take on a new shape. It wasn't just Lucas pushing against the illness anymore. Inspired by her son's unwavering light, a spark of fight returned to Sarah's own eyes. She started doing the small physical therapy exercises the doctor had recommended, her movements shaky but determined. One morning, she asked for scrambled eggs, the first time she'd requested a specific food in months. She started talking about the future, about what they would do when she was stronger. "We should plant some tomatoes in the backyard this spring, Lukey," she said one day, her voice thin but clear. The dynamic in the house shifted. He was no longer just a caregiver, and she was no longer just a patient. They were a team. They were fighting this battle together, and their shared love became a powerful, healing force, nourishing them both. One evening, the light outside was soft and orange. Sarah was sitting up in bed, propped against her pillows, looking stronger than she had in a long, long time. She called Lucas over, her eyes shining with a light he hadn't seen since before the sickness began. She took both of his small, calloused hands in hers. Tears welled up and traced paths down her pale cheeks, but they weren't tears of pain. "Lucas," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I know this has been so hard for you. I want you to know, I see it. I see everything you've done." She squeezed his hands. "You have been my angel. Your love, it has been the real medicine. You saved me, baby. You saved me." In that moment, the entire weight of the world lifted from Lucas's 8-year-old shoulders. every silent prayer, every moment of terror, every thankless task was seen and named and cherished. He leaned his head against her shoulder and finally cried, not from fear or loneliness, but from a wave of pure, overwhelming love. The cold ground didn't care about his tears. It just drank them up, pulling the warmth from his small body. Lucas kept his eyes squeezed shut. The image of his mother's pale face burned into the back of his eyelids. The alley was silent again, his desperate silent prayer hanging in the air like smoke. He felt empty, hollowed out. He had given his last bit of hope to the darkness, and the darkness had given nothing back. He shivered, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that had nothing to do with the evening chill. He was alone. He would always be alone. But then something changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, like the first hint of sun on a frozen morning. A gentle warmth began to spread through his chest, pushing back against the icy grip of despair. It was a peace so profound, so out of place in this grimy alley, that it startled him. He thought maybe he was imagining it, that his tired mind was finally playing tricks on him. A hand rested on his shoulder. It wasn't heavy or forceful. It was light but firm and impossibly real. The warmth seemed to flow from that single point of contact, a current of pure comfort that traveled down his arm and settled in his heart. Lucas's breath hitched. He was afraid to open his eyes. Maybe it was a police officer or someone who would tell him to go home. Maybe it was someone who would see the mess he was and turn away. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his head and blinked, his vision blurred by tears. Kneeling beside him, on the same cracked and dirty pavement, was a man. He wasn't tall and imposing. He wasn't glowing with an otherworldly light. His clothes were simple, the kind you might see on any working man, and his hands were calloused. But his face held everything. There were lines of sorrow and joy around his eyes, and a kindness so deep it felt ancient. He looked at Lucas, and in his gaze there was no pity, no shock, no judgment. There was only a perfect, complete understanding. It was as if this man could see straight through Lucas's skin, past the brave little caregiver, and right into the heart of the terrified 8-year-old boy who just wanted his mum. The man's lips parted, and he spoke. His voice was quiet, not a boom from the heavens, but a gentle murmur that seemed to quiet the entire world. "I heard you, Lucas." The words were simple, just 4 words, but they struck Lucas with the force of a tidal wave. I heard you. All the silent pleas in the dead of night, all the whispered prayers over a bottle of medicine, all the bargains he'd tried to make with a God he wasn't even sure was listening. He heard it all. You are not alone. And with that, the dam inside Lucas finally broke. A sob escaped his throat, raw and ragged. For years, being alone was the one single truth of his life. It was the air he breathed, the food he ate, the shadow that followed him everywhere. To hear it denied, to have that terrible truth erased by this calm, certain presence, was too much to bear. The man didn't flinch. He didn't try to quiet him. He just stayed there, kneeling with him, his hand a steady, reassuring weight on his shoulder, a silent promise to share the burden. Lucas looked at him again, really looked at him. He didn't know who this man was, not with his mind, but his heart, the part of him that had been crying out in the dark, knew. It recognized the peace. It recognized the love. This was the someone he had begged for, not an angel with wings or a king on a throne, just a companion who was willing to get his knees dirty, who was willing to meet him right where he was, in the middle of the brokenness. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. The sounds of the city faded away. The smell of damp garbage and decay was replaced by something clean, like fresh bread or rain on dry earth. The alley, a place of forgotten things, suddenly felt like the most important place on earth. It was a cathedral of cracked concrete, a sanctuary of discarded hope. Lucas felt his trembling slowly subside. The fear that had been a constant knot in his stomach for as long as he could remember began to loosen its grip. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer in charge. He finally found his voice, a small, shaky whisper. Who are you?" The man smiled, and it was a smile that could mend broken things. "I am a friend," he said, "and I'm here to walk with you." In that moment, kneeling next to a stranger who felt more familiar than anyone he had ever known, Lucas understood. The miracle hadn't come as a flash of lightning or a sudden cure. It had come as a quiet presence. It had come with a hand on his shoulder and a voice that said his name. The healing hadn't started in his mother's body. It had started right here, in his own terrified heart. With that quiet truth echoing in his soul, Lucas finally looked up. The man's eyes weren't filled with pity or divine authority. They were just kind, so incredibly kind. It gave Lucas the courage to ask the only question that mattered, the one that had been screaming inside him for years. His voice was a tiny, trembling whisper, almost lost in the alley's silence. Are you going to make her better?" He braced himself for the answer. He hoped for a simple, powerful yes. A booming promise that would erase all the fear. He expected it. He needed it. But the man, Jesus, didn't give him that. Instead, he looked at Lucas with a deep, aching compassion, as if he understood the weight of that simple question. "I am here to walk through this with you, Lucas," Jesus said, his voice as gentle as the light that seemed to surround them. "The healing has already begun, but it may not look the way you expect." Confusion pricked at Lucas's heart. It felt like a non-answer, a politician's answer. "But she's in pain," he insisted, the desperation returning. "I just want the pain to stop. I want her to be like the moms, the ones who can walk to the park and make dinner." His chin began to wobble again. He had been so sure, for one brief shining moment, that everything was about to be fixed. Jesus nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the boy's face. "I know," he said, "and I see every ounce of that pain. But a true miracle, Lucas, is not always the instant removal of a storm. Sometimes the miracle is the strength and peace to walk through it without being washed away. It's the hand that holds yours in the dark so you're not afraid." He paused, letting the words settle. "Imagine you're in a small boat in the middle of a raging sea. You pray for the storm to stop. But what if, instead of calming the waves, I climbed into the boat with you? The storm would still be there, the waves would still crash, but you would no longer be alone. You would know, with every part of your being, that you were going to make it to the other side. Which one is the greater miracle?" Lucas thought about it. He pictured their little house as the boat. He pictured his mother's illness as the storm, a storm that had been raging for as long as he could remember. He had always felt like he was in that boat by himself, bailing water with a tiny bucket, exhausted and terrified of the next giant wave. The idea of someone else being in there with him. It didn't make the storm go away, but it changed everything. "So, you're not going to fix her?" he asked, the disappointment still heavy in his voice. "I am going to help you both heal," Jesus corrected him gently. "Some of the most profound miracles are slow, quiet, and forged in the fires of endurance. They are built day by day, choice by choice. The healing your mother needs is not just for her body, and the healing you need is for your heart. That's where we must begin." He looked around the forgotten alley, at the broken furniture and the weeds pushing through the cracks in the pavement. "You came to this place because you felt as broken and discarded as everything around you. You felt unseen. But I see you, Lucas. I have always seen you. My presence with you right now is the miracle. It is the beginning. It is the promise that no matter what happens, you will never, ever face it alone again." A strange calm began to spread through Lucas's chest, pushing back the edges of his fear. It wasn't the explosive joy he had hoped for, but it was something deeper. Something steadier. It was the feeling of a foundation being laid under his feet, right there on the cold, dirty ground. He still didn't understand everything. He still wanted his mum to be healthy more than anything in the world. But for the first time, the thought of waking up tomorrow didn't feel quite so terrifying. The crushing weight on his small shoulders felt lighter. It wasn't gone, but it was now a weight he felt strong enough to share. The man beside him wasn't a magician who would wave a hand and make all the problems disappear. He was a companion, a friend who promised to stay in the boat until the storm passed. And somehow, in that desolate alley, that felt like more than enough. The cold night air eventually gave way to the pale grey light of dawn. Lucas didn't remember walking back inside or climbing into his own small bed. Sleep hadn't been a deep, restful escape, but a quiet, floating peace he hadn't felt in years. When his eyes opened, the first thing he noticed wasn't the usual knot of dread in his stomach. It was replaced by a strange, gentle warmth, a quiet hum of stillness that seemed to echo the feeling of the hand that had rested on his shoulder. For a moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream, a fantasy cooked up by a tired and lonely mind. But the feeling was too real, too present. He swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. The house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the heavy, anxious quiet he was used to, but a calm, waiting stillness. He crept to his mother's bedroom door, his heart beginning to beat a little faster, a mix of old fear and new, fragile hope. He pushed the door open just a crack, peeking inside, bracing himself for the familiar sight of her lying pale and still against the pillows. But that's not what he saw. Sarah was sitting up. Her back was propped against the headboard, and she was looking out the window at the morning sky. It wasn't a strong, confident posture, but she was upright, her thin shoulders squared. The grey, almost translucent quality of her skin had been replaced by a faint, delicate touch of colour in her cheeks, like the first hint of a sunrise. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He pushed the door open wider, the slight creak of the hinges making her turn her head, and then she smiled. It wasn't the weak, pained smile he had seen on her good days. This was a real smile, one that reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. It was the smile he remembered from before, from the time when they would have picnics in the park and she would chase him through the grass. It was a smile that held life in it. "Hey, sweetie," she said. Her voice was still soft, but it had a clarity, a gentle strength that had been missing for so long. Lucas just stood there, frozen in the doorway, unable to process what he was seeing. He felt a lump form in his throat. "Mom," he whispered, the single word carrying all his doubt and disbelief. You're sitting up." She nodded, her smile widening a little. "I am. I woke up a little while ago and just felt like I could." She took a slow, deliberate breath. "I had the most wonderful sleep, Lucas. No nightmares, no pain, just peace. I feel like I haven't really slept in years." He walked slowly to her bedside, his hand reaching out as if to make sure she was real. He lightly touched her forehead. It was cool, no fever. He looked into her eyes, searching for the familiar haze of exhaustion and pain, but it was gone. In its place was a clear, calm light. She saw the tears welling up in his own eyes and reached out, her hand covering his. Her touch, usually so frail and cold, had a faint warmth to it. "I feel a little stronger today," she said softly, as if she were as surprised as he was. "Just a little, but it's there." It wasn't a cure. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic healing that erased all signs of her illness. She was still weak, the blanket still pooled around a frame that was far too thin. But it was something. It was a shift. It was a crack in the suffocating wall of despair that had surrounded them for so long, and through that crack a tiny, brilliant sliver of light was pouring in. A cautious, fragile hope began to bloom in Lucas's chest. It was a terrifying feeling, because hope could be crushed. He had learned that lesson the hard way, but this felt different. This felt real. It felt like the quiet answer to a desperate prayer whispered in a forgotten alley. He squeezed her hand gently, unable to find the words to explain the storm of emotion inside him. He didn't have to. For the first time in a long time, they just looked at each other, a mother and a son, sharing a moment not of sickness, but of possibility. He turned his head slightly, his gaze drifting towards the back of the house, towards the alley door. He couldn't see it from here, but he could feel it. He could still feel the lingering warmth of a presence that had knelt beside him in the dirt, a friend who had promised to stay in the boat. This small, beautiful change wasn't the storm suddenly vanishing. It was the first sign of the clouds beginning to part, the quiet promise that the sun was still there, waiting to shine again. The fragile hope that had settled in Lucas's chest was a quiet, delicate thing. He guarded it carefully, afraid the slightest breeze of reality might blow it out. He spent the morning watching his mother sleep, noticing the steady, even rhythm of her breathing. It was a sound he hadn't realized he'd missed so desperately. For the first time in a long time, the silence in the house didn't feel heavy with dread. It felt peaceful, like a held breath finally released. He made himself a small bowl of cereal, eating it at the kitchen table and looking out the back door toward the alley. It didn't look like a place of despair anymore. It looked like a place where a promise had been made. Then, in the late afternoon, a sound shattered the quiet. A firm, solid knock on the front door. Lucas froze, the spoon halfway to his mouth. No one ever knocked on their door. Salespeople skipped their small, worn-out house. Friends didn't call because he didn't really have any. His heart began to pound a familiar, frantic rhythm against his ribs. Was it bad news? Someone from a hospital? An agency? Every possibility that flashed through his mind was terrifying. He crept to the door, his small hand hesitating on the knob. He peered through the peephole, his breath catching in his throat. It was Mr. Henderson, in from next door. An old man with kind, crinkly eyes, who Lucas had only ever seen tending to his rose bushes or collecting his mail. He was a quiet fixture of the neighborhood, a man who existed in the background of Lucas's life. He was holding a large pot, steam gently rising from the lid, and tucked under his other arm was a brown paper grocery bag. Lucas slowly turned the lock and opened the door, just a crack. "Hello there, son," Mr. Henderson said, his voice softer than Lucas expected. It was a gentle, grandfatherly sound. "I hope I'm not bothering you." He shifted the weight of the pot. "My wife, God rest her soul, she always used to say that chicken soup could fix just about anything. I was making a big batch and, well, I made way too much." He offered a small, slightly shy smile. "And I was at the grocery store this morning, and I just had this feeling. A little nudge, you could say. I felt like you and your mom could maybe use a few things." Lucas just stared, speechless. He didn't know what to say. Mr. Henderson didn't wait for an answer. He gently placed the heavy pot into Lucas's hands. The warmth immediately seeped through the towel wrapped around it, a comforting heat that spread up his arms. Then he handed over the grocery bag. It was surprisingly heavy. "There's some milk in there and some bread, a few other odds and ends. Don't you worry about a thing," he said, patting Lucas's shoulder lightly. "You just take care of your mum. You're a good boy." And with that, he turned and walked back to his own house, his steps slow and steady on the pavement. Lucas closed the door, his mind reeling. He carried the items to the kitchen counter as if they were sacred relics. He lifted the lid off the pot, and the rich, savory smell of chicken and herbs filled the small room. It smelled like home. It smelled like care. He peeked inside the grocery bag. There was a carton of milk, a loaf of fresh bread, a box of crackers, and a jar of peanut butter. Simple. Things, miraculous things. It was food they desperately needed, food he had been terrified he wouldn't be able to get. As he stood there, surrounded by the evidence of this impossible kindness, a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the soup. It was the same feeling he'd had in the alley, the gentle, undeniable presence of his companion. He didn't see him, not this time, but he heard him, not with his ears, but with his heart. The thought bloomed in his mind, as clear and true as his own name. "See, Lucas, this is how it works. This is how I answer prayers. My love is not always a thunderclap from the sky. More often, it is a quiet knock on the door. It is made real through the hands of a neighbor who listens to a gentle nudge. My miracles often have the faces of the people I send. Tears welled in Lucas's eyes, but these were not the hot, desperate tears of the alley. These were tears of overwhelming relief, of profound, soul-shaking gratitude. He finally understood. He had been looking for a grand, divine intervention, a sudden flash of light that would erase all his problems. But the miracle wasn't the absence of the storm. It was a lighthouse appearing in the fog. It was the quiet kindness of an old man who decided to listen to a feeling. It was a pot of soup, a loaf of bread. It was the simple, beautiful human way that heaven reached down to earth, not to erase the struggle, but to make sure no one had to go through it all alone. But that fragile, newfound hope was a delicate thing, like a candle flame in a drafty room. For 2 days, the light held steady. Sarah had a little more color in her cheeks. She ate a full bowl of the soup Mr. Henderson had brought. They talked, really talked. For the first time in what felt like years, Lucas felt a lightness in his chest he had almost forgotten was possible. The world was still hard, but it was no longer crushing him. He had a companion. Then, on the 3rd night, the draft blew in. Started with a cough, a dry, rattling sound that sent a spike of ice through Lucas's heart. He rushed to her bedside. Her forehead was burning with fever. The brief flicker of strength was gone, replaced by a profound weakness that seemed to pull her down into the mattress. All the progress, every small victory vanished in an hour. Despair, cold and familiar, wrapped around him again. But this time it was different. It was laced with a bitter sting of betrayal. It felt like a cruel joke, a trick. He had been given a glimpse of the sun, only to have the door slammed shut again, leaving him in a darkness that felt even deeper than before. The anger came next, hot and sharp. He ran. He didn't even grab a jacket, just burst out the back door and stumbled into the alley. The cold bit at his skin, but he didn't care. He fell to his knees on the same patch of broken concrete. "I thought you were helping!" he yelled, the words torn from his throat in a ragged sob. He wasn't speaking to anyone, and yet he was speaking to a very specific someone. Why? Why would you show me what it could be like, just to take it away? Was it all just a dream? Was I just imagining it? He slammed his small fist against the ground, the sharp sting of the gravel doing nothing to dull the pain in his soul. "It's not fair." He waited for the warmth, for the gentle light, but for a long moment there was only the cold, the dark, and the echoing silence of his own broken heart. Then the feeling came. Not a light this time, but a quiet, steady presence beside him. Jesus was there, kneeling again in the dirt and grime, his expression holding no disappointment, no judgment, only a deep, sorrowful understanding. He didn't offer an excuse or a defense. He simply sat with Lucas in his anger, letting the boy's frustration pour out into the cold night air. When Lucas's sobs finally quieted, Jesus spoke, his voice a gentle balm on a raw wound. "Lucas," he said softly, "I never promised the path would be easy. I only promised that you would not have to walk it alone." Lucas looked up, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "But she was getting better." "Yes," Jesus agreed, "and she will again. A journey of healing is not a straight line. It has hills and valleys. I'm not just with you on the good days, Lucas. I'm especially here for these. Faith is not measured on the mountaintops when the sun is shining. It is forged right here in the valley, when the shadows are long and you feel lost." It was a lesson that settled deep in Lucas's bones. God's love wasn't a reward for believing. It was a constant presence that held him even when his belief wavered and broke. "But what do I do?" Lucas whispered, feeling small and helpless all over again. Jesus' gaze was kind. "You are already doing it," he said, and he began to show Lucas something new. He didn't show him a vision of the future or a grand miracle. He showed Lucas himself. He brought to the boy's mind the image of him holding his mother's hand, of him reading her a story in a soft voice, of him carefully measuring her medicine even when his own hands were shaking. "Look at what you do, Lucas," Jesus' voice echoed in his heart. That love, that fierce, unending love, it is the most powerful medicine of all. It is a channel for my healing. You are not just a boy waiting for me to fix everything. You are my partner in this. You are a warrior of love, and your fight is holy. Lucas saw it then. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't helpless. His simple daily actions, the ones that felt so small and useless against such a big illness, were his power. They were his prayers in action. He went back inside, the anger gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it no longer owned him. He walked into his mother's room. She was asleep, her breathing shallow. The fever was still high. Nothing had physically changed, but everything within Lucas had. Instead of pacing or worrying, he pulled a chair to her bedside. He gently took her hand, its warmth fragile in his own, and he just sat there. He didn't pray for a miracle. He didn't ask for the fever to break. He just sat, offering his quiet, steady presence. An hour passed in silence. The only sound was their breathing. In that shared stillness, a profound peace settled over the room. Sarah's pained expression softened in her sleep. Her breathing became a little deeper, a little more even. Lucas learned one of the deepest truths that night. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone who is suffering is to simply be with them, sharing the weight of the silence. With this new understanding, Lucas's entire world began to shift. He started to see grace, not just in the big interventions, but in the tiny, ordinary moments. He noticed the way the morning sun slanted across the floorboards, painting them gold. He heard the cheerful song of a robin outside the window, a defiant burst of life. He felt the warmth from the mug of tea Mr. Henderson brought over one morning, a simple kindness that felt like a hug. These weren't random events anymore. They were winks from God, little miracles, reminding him that a loving presence was woven into the very fabric of his life. The fear didn't vanish. It was a stubborn shadow that followed him. One night, as he lay in bed, the what-ifs started to creep in. What if the fever came back worse? What if the medicine stopped working? He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, but instead of letting it spiral, he spoke into the darkness. "I'm still scared," he admitted, as if Jesus were sitting right there, and the answering thought came, calm and strong. Courage is not the absence of fear, Lucas. It is acting in spite of it. Every time you choose to bring your mother a glass of water when you are terrified, every time you choose to believe in tomorrow when today is bleak, you are performing an act of immense courage. He didn't have to defeat the fear. He just had to choose love again and again, and something began to change in Sarah too. Seeing the steady, quiet strength in her son, a new fire was lit within her. His hope became her hope. She started to fight back, not just endure. She did the small physical therapy exercises the doctor recommended, even when it hurt. She made herself eat, even when she had no appetite. She started talking about the future again, about seeing him play baseball in the spring, about planting a small garden out back. It was no longer just Lucas caring for a sick mother. They were a team. They were fighting together, their shared love a force field against the despair. One evening, a few weeks later, Sarah was sitting up in bed, propped against the pillows. She had been reading a book, and the color in her cheeks was real and lasting. She called Lucas over. She took both of his small, calloused hands in hers. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of overwhelming love. "Lucas," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I know how hard this has been. I see you. I see everything you've done. You have been my angel, my little warrior. Your love, Lucas, your love has been the real medicine. You saved me." And in that moment it all came together. All the fear, the sacrifice, the lonely nights, the desperate prayers. It was all seen. It was all worth it. This was the climax. Not a sudden magical cure from the heavens, but a mother looking at her son and recognizing the depth of his love, and that love being the very thing that pulled her back to the light. Lucas hugged her, burying his face in her shoulder, and he cried, not from sorrow, but from a release so profound it shook his whole body. He had been heard, he had been seen, he was loved. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, a new normal settled over their small house. Sarah's illness didn't disappear entirely, but it retreated. It became a manageable part of their lives, not the center of it. She could cook again, they could take short walks. The constant cloud of crisis lifted, replaced by the simple, beautiful sunlight of ordinary days. And as the fear receded, a new feeling grew in Lucas's heart, a deep, quiet compassion. He thought about other kids, other families, living in the silent grip of fear and illness. He thought about how lonely he had been, and he felt a gentle pull, a purpose forming in his soul. He had learned a great secret, and it wasn't meant to be kept to himself. One last time, he went to the alley. He didn't go in desperation or anger, but with a heart full of gratitude. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow on the cracked pavement. Jesus was there, waiting for him, his smile as warm as the sunlight. "You don't need me to kneel beside you anymore, do you?" Jesus asked gently. Lucas looked at the place where he had once collapsed in despair, and he understood. The visible presence had been a scaffold, a support to help him rebuild his faith on a stronger foundation. But now that presence was inside him, a permanent part of his heart. "You have learned the great secret, Lucas," Jesus said, his voice filled with love. "My strength is not found in changing your circumstances, but in changing your heart within them. Now go and be a light for others who are still lost in the dark." And with that, the presence faded, but the peace remained, stronger and more real than ever before. The world rarely changes overnight. The greatest miracles are not the earthquakes and the thunder, but the slow, quiet transformations of the human heart. They are the discovery that love is stronger than fear, that presence is more powerful than any problem, and that even in the darkest, most forgotten alley of our lives, we are never, ever alone. Perhaps you have a story of a quiet miracle in your own life, a moment of unexpected kindness, a feeling of peace in a storm. If you feel comfortable, share it in the comments below. Your story could be the light that someone else desperately needs to see today. And if this message touched your heart, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, Divine Whisper, so we can continue to share stories of hope. My final question to you is this: when you find yourself in the valley, when the shadows are long and your faith is tested, what is the one small act of love you can choose? Thank you for listening. This is Valentino, wishing you peace on your journey.